pole and paddle, axe and machete. Carried along by the swift water, the expedition's 7 dugouts snaked through the forest single file. The jungle was thickest at the river's edge, where the trees crowded along the banks in a timeless battle for sunlight. They were matted together with vines and epiphytes that trailed in the water like heavy curtains and completely obscured the muddy bank. From his position in the last and largest canoe, which had a carrying capacity of 1.25 tons, Roosevelt, along with Cherry, Dr. Kajizira, and their 3 paddlers, could see the 6 dugouts floating in a long, broken chain ahead of him. Directly in front of him were the 2 balsas, or rafts, which carried 8 camaradas and most of the expedition's baggage, but were even more difficult to steer than the rest of the boats. Rondon, Lyra, and 3 paddlers rowed in the second dugout, and Kermit and 2 camaradas sat in the smallest canoe at the head of the expedition. As we drifted and paddled down the swirling brown current through the vivid rain-drenched green of the tropic forest, the trees leaned over the river from both banks, Roosevelt wrote. There were many palms, both the burity with its stiff fronds like enormous fans, and a handsome species of bacaba with very long, gracefully curving fronds. In places, the palms stood close together, towering and slender, their stems a stately colonnade, their fronds an arched fretwork against the sky. Roosevelt reveled in the beauty and variety of the plant and the fragrant scents that were blown to us. Roosevelt reveled in the beauty and the variety of the plant life and the, quote, fragrant scents that were blown to us from flowers on the banks. But he was puzzled by a distinct and eerie absence of sound. In the midst of all this lush life was a seemingly incongruent stillness. Quote, we heard strange calls from the depths of the woods. For the most part, the forest was silent, unquote. Cherry, too, was struck by how empty the jungle seemed. Very little animal life was seen along the shore, he scribbled in his diary. All right, folks, welcome to the Gritty Podcast. That is where we're starting our story today. Once again, we're reading from the book The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey by Candace Millard. For those that have been following along with our series of podcasts on this, you've heard us, you're all caught up. If you haven't, go back and check out the other episodes that we've done leading up to this point. If you don't want to do that, I'll give you a brief summary. Right now, Theodore Roosevelt is in the middle of the Amazon jungle that took a month or so to hike through the jungle. They've got themselves on an expedition journey to discover a river that no civilized man has actually attempted. They don't know where the river ends, and it looks like it goes right through the very heart of the Amazon jungle. Everything in the jungle seems to want to kill them, between insects, poisonous animals, insects, snakes, and so on, some of the most poisonous in the world. Rivers full of piranhas and caiman and other leeches and parasites, those ones that swim up your pecker, those kinds of things, not good. A pretty freaky place to try to attempt to go through. Most men never survive a journey like this. Why Roosevelt did it and stuff, it just sort of has, you have to listen to the earlier podcast. It just sort of, one thing led to another, and he was like, let's just do this. So here we are. They have they're just now beginning to float down the Amazon. In today's chapter, we're going to cover a little bit about what it was like, the first floating that they've, now we're in it, dude. There's no turning back. And we're going to talk about what the Amazon jungle is like, because we have this misconception that the jungle's full of life and there's so much food just growing on trees and so on. But what we're going to find out about the Amazon that's unique is it's actually a very nutrition depleted environment, because everything is, imagine a family of 10 kids 100 years ago in a relatively poverty stricken home, and they set the table for dinner. It's sort of like there's no food around to begin with, and those kids devour every scrap they can, and then it's gone again. There's a lot of competition for food. It's sort of like that. Like everything in the jungle is starving to death or on the edge. And so if a nutrient, a dead animal, for example, dies in the jungle, in the Amazon, it is basically subsumed by the jungle in minutes, becomes part of, and then everything is just kind of waiting for something else so the soil is depleted. And we're going to get into that a little more today. But it's a pretty fascinating journey. I think you're going to enjoy this series of podcasts. If you haven't been following along, go back, check them out. It's really a lesson in the mistakes that can be made that can cost you your life. It's also a lesson in, hey, we have it pretty good right now in the country we live in the century we live in. It's also eye-opening because Brent's gone down these deep rabbit holes on the Amazon. Mm-hmm. And he's discovering that there are people down there that have no idea that we exist, that still live primitive, naked lives.
And they cover themselves in painted. They color the mud, then they paint themselves with it. A lot of them do. Mm-hmm. And so you have people out there that are like bright blue and like bright red.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
And also, it's not a parasite. It's a fish.
Oh, that swims up your
pecker. Yeah. It's called the candiru.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't I say?
Yeah. Do you know how they get rid of the candiru?
I don't even want to know.
Well, they don't have a good way. They pretty much are like, well, you live with it or you cut your pecker off.
Oh, man, that is brutal. So basically, they say never urinate in waters like that with those in there, because then the heat from the urine, they figure that out or whatever, and they swim up the hole.
Well, they have barbs.
They're barbed, right? So there's a one way they don't come out.
And they like living in the urethra.
Right. It's making me sick.
And so they project their barbs, and now every time you pee, you essentially are trying to shove this cork out of your
right,
with barbs going in one direction. And the natives, they're like, you can take a hot bath, you can drink this herbal remedy, but basically, like, one guy says, get crap face drunk. Mm-hmm. And so your pee is like super acidic, and you're not really able to. Basically, you have to drink so much alcohol, your body can't process it. Mm-hmm. And the theory is it gets the fish drunk, and then it falls asleep, and then you can pee it out. But apparently, that's
just don't get one.
Just don't pee in the Amazon River. That's really it. Like, there's zero reason to get in the water of the Amazon River. None. Like, there's no upside.
Well, they swim quite a bit, Brent, in this book on this journey.
Because they were foolish. They didn't know any better, bro.
So we're going to get a little more into that. Let's get back to the book. Before we do, I want to remind you to use the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops. Use it at Seek Outside. Use it at Goat Knives. Use it at Sheep Feet. Use the code over at our buddy Treeline Pursuits, Mark Livesey, for his Master E-Scouting class. It's worth every penny. And use the code GRITTY at... Did I say Valkyrie Archery?
Nope. Well, you can now.
Valkyrie Archery. And you save 10%, not 5, 10% at Valkyrie Archery. And then, of course, Heather's Choice, 'tis the season to get yourself some packaroons and backcountry meals. And then Sissy Sticks. Get yourself some killer trekking poles. All right.
They used to make special penis covers out of coconut. So they would get chunks of coconut shells, and they would try to wrap them around the penis and then tie them off to keep the fish from being able to swim. These are the natives. And a lot of natives they get a piece of rope and they just tie off their penis at the head so the fish can't swim up into it.
Well, that's a lot of information.
I'm going to close this tab. I don't want to read it anymore. It just keeps getting worse.
All right. Thanks, Gritty Broman.
You're welcome.
That was helpful.
On to the book.
All right, back to the book. While Roosevelt and Cherry studied the rainforest, their paddlers kept their eyes on the river. Pulling the dugout through the water with their long wooden paddles, they searched for a telltale ripple, their only warning that a fallen tree lay just below the surface. The rainy season downpours that had been such a source of misery to the men on their overland journey had caused the river to swell to such a height that most of the sunken trees and boulders were safely buried under several feet of water. Some, such as the water-loving Boritana palms, continued to grow and thrive, although they were fully submerged, the current shaking their broad crowns like a strong wind. Other fallen trees, however, still lay close to the surface, and whenever they appeared, the current seemed invariably to drive the expedition's canoes straight down on top of them. It was then, Roosevelt wrote, that the muscles stood out on the backs and arms of the paddlers as stroke on stroke they urged us away from and past the obstacle. The boats were so heavy, they're not that maneuverable. Like we said, they're dugouts, so they're like floating logs, really. They said they could weigh, one dugout could weigh up to 2,500 pounds. So you're dealing with a massive...
How do they even float? That's a freaking car.
It's a big log. So, like he said, the muscles are ripping and you're working hard. The strength and skill of the camaradas was evident as they maneuvered their craft down the river. Rondon had hired rugged young men in Tapir-Poen to be their paddlers and porters. They were a strapping set, Roosevelt wrote admiringly. They were expert rivermen and men of the forest, skilled veterans in wilderness work. They were lithe as panthers and brawny as bears. They swam like water dogs. They were equally at home with pole and paddle, with axe and machete. Roosevelt realized, however, that great difficulty often brought out the worst in a man. Deep in the Amazon, the expedition was utterly isolated and far from help of any kind. The camaradas, who outnumbered the officers nearly 3-1, could mutiny as easily as sailors at sea. They were all capable men, and most of them were brave, but they had lived a hard life. They looked, Roosevelt wrote, like pirates in the pictures of Howard Pyle and Maxfield Parrish. One glance at them revealed the almost unbridgeable difference between their hardscrabble world and Roosevelt's refined and privileged one. For clothing, they had brought along nothing more than the thin shirts and ragged pants that they wore, and most of them were barefoot. Their feet and hands were as hard and gnarled as their rough-hewn paddles. Their faces, some bright and cheerful, others dark and glowering, were usually obscured by their slouching and soiled hats. It would take time for the officers, especially the Americans, to get to know their paddlers and to learn those on whom they could rely, even trusting them with their own lives, and those on whom they should never turn their backs. There's an ominous foretelling. Even Roosevelt's own boatmen represented the extremes of good and bad among the camaradas. His steersman, a black man from Mato Grosso named Luis Correa, and his paddler Antonio Parechi, a member of the peaceful Parechi Indian tribe that the expedition had met in Utiarity, were two of the best men in the expedition. Over the course of the journey, both of them would earn Roosevelt's respect by proving that they not only knew the rainforest, but were willing to work hard for the success of the expedition. The third camarada in Roosevelt's boat, however, was Julio de Lima, the broad-shouldered, hot-tempered Brazilian who had attacked another man with a knife during the overland journey. Apparently, Amilcar had not shared his concerns about Julio with Rondon, because not only had the volatile camarada been chosen among the select group of men who were to descend the River of Doubt, but he was now Roosevelt's own bowman. And he turns out to be quite the coward, evil person. So we're going to get into that, but not anytime soon. But there you have it. You have some of the best men that Roosevelt comes to respect, and they respect him. And then you have some of the worst men, the weakest men in humanity.
I've been pretty
He's a
mad
very
at some
strong,
people.
vicious man, but he's also a coward.
Oh, is he? I've been pretty mad at people before, but I've never pulled a knife on anybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's an intense thing to do, right? Like, that's, wow. So, that's just sort of giving you some context for what it is that, where they're at right now on the river. From the moment their boats were swept into the unknown, Rondon set his plan for the expedition into motion. The Brazilian colonel was interested not in adventure but in geographical precision, and he was determined to survey the river carefully and completely from its headwaters to its mouth. There were no reference points in the vast jungle, so the men would have to rely on celestial navigation to tell them where they were. What was celestial navigation, Brent?
Well, if I can remember from the top of my head, celestial navigation is the use of angular measurements between celestial bodies and the visible horizon to locate one's position in the world. On land as well as at sea, at any given time, any celestial body is located directly over one point on the Earth's surface.
Nice. You just pulled that out of thin air, huh?
Out of the ether.
Wow, you're just a wealth of information.
I'm a walking Wikipedia.
So, celestial navigation. To determine latitude and longitude, the expedition used the same instrument that Humboldt himself had used, a sextant, which measures the angle between the horizon and the sun, moon, or stars, to chart the river from point to point. Rondon instituted a fixed station method of survey, one of the most accurate methods, but also the most labor-intensive. Not only did it require repeated, detailed measurements, but it also demanded frequent stops, especially on a river that wound as tightly as the River of Doubt. For the sake of accuracy, Rondon was more than willing to endure the tedium, grueling work, and danger that the fixed station survey demanded. However, as in many great undertakings, the expedition's commander would not suffer alone. In the lead canoe, Kermit had accepted the unenviable job of placing the sighting rod that Lyra and Rondon would use to make their measurements. Kermit and his paddlers would find a spot that afforded the longest unimpeded view both upstream and downstream, usually at a bend in the river, land their boat, and, using a machete, cut away the thick branches and vines that covered the bank, fighting off swarms of biting ants and angry wasps, and then Kermit would plant his sighting rod, a slim pole on which a red disc and a white disc had been positioned 1 meter apart, in the thin black leaf litter under his feet. Lyra would then use a telemeter to establish the distance between his canoe and the sighting rod, and Rondon would consult his compass and record the river's direction. So they're mapping out the river with that rod. They're basically, in essence, measuring it. Mm-hmm. So they want to measure it basically before the river turns at every section. Every time you leave that last place, you got to kind of measure the next place. It seems like, especially with a river that doubles back on itself at times because it's wound so tight back and forth with so many turns, and you're trying to survive, a 2 to 3 month journey. That's a very slow and tedious way to measure and map out the river. And basically he measures the distance, and then he uses his compass to say which direction that distance is, and then they're just drawing it out. I don't know, that's quite the endeavor. The river twisted and turned so capriciously, curving literally toward every point of the compass, Roosevelt remarked, that Kermit had to land, cut away the vegetation, and set up the sighting rod 114 times the first day. Jeez. 114 times the first day. So think about it. He's got to get out, chop his way through, not get bit by insects or wasps or anything like that, make a spot on the bank, stick the thing in the bank, the measuring rod, and then the other guys then measure based on the distance between the top and the bottom marker, how small or how big they are. The further you are away, the closer it gets, right? The closer you are. And then they can do some backwards math and then go, oh, we're 100 yards, we're 500 yards. Mm-hmm. It's the same way in Boy Scouts. You learn how to measure the height of a tree with a compass and some establishing basically measuring at this yardage. If it's an inch tall, then I know that it's, so high, and you do some of that kind of math. Anyway, that's what they're doing, and that's what they're up to. Well, Roosevelt's not real happy with that process, but because he's, not the colonel, and it's not his neck of the woods, it's not his area of expertise, he's like, and he realizes Rondon's desire for perfection. He is in support of Rondon, even though he doesn't like that Kermit is risking himself all the time, because every time Kermit has to land that boat, he's got to get in the water. He's got to maybe get in where piranhas are or other things, risk getting bit by a snake. Like every time you get out of that boat, we read in our last podcast, you're risking your life. Your boat is your safety sanctuary. As long as you're in there, you're probably okay. As soon as you step out of the boat, from natives and wild animals to poisonous things to anacondas. It's like
black caiman. There's 3 kinds of caiman down there, but the black ones are the big ones.
Yeah.
We have the penis fish we've spoken about. Somewhere between 60 and 90 species of piranha.
Yeah. So there's so Theodore is not happy about this, especially that Kermit is the one taking all the risks, and they're also at the very, very front of the line. So if they hit a waterfall, rapids, or whatever, Kermit's boat is the one that is at the most risk. It's the one charging ahead. Mm-hmm. But he's like, I'm going to defer to Rondon. I'm going to let Rondon kind of run the thing, and then we'll see. If it could be the case that we got to abandon this much detail once it's just a run for survival. Right now, it's like, well, I guess I'm going to defer. So then they pull out. Some of the crew moves ahead on this day, and Roosevelt lands his boat. They get up close to the shore, and this is their first night in the jungle. And they get up there, and they say they set up their camp, and then they settled in and waited for their companions. Their boat rocking in the current and the rain. Finally, after 2 more hours had passed, and they hadn't seen the rest of their crew, including Kermit and all those guys, because they're behind because they keep doing these measurements. The rest of the crew moved ahead. Roosevelt ordered the camaradas to make camp. And so it was only 4 p.m., but they could not go forward without the rest of the expedition. They had no idea when they would all be reunited. So anyway, they all get together and they all sleep that night. By the time Kermit, Rondon, and Lyra and their 6 paddlers appeared, filthy and exhausted, the sun was already setting. And Franca, the cook, had, as he had time and again for the past month, miraculously started a fire from sodden wood. As the men sat around the sputtering campfire, the rain tapered off, leaving a clear, star-scattered sky above them. Beyond their little circle of light, however, the jungle was so black that had a sudden rain doused their fire, the men would not have been able to see their own hands, much less one another. Only 6 miles into their expedition, they could hardly feel their isolation more profoundly. But as they sank into their hammocks that night, their first on the banks of the River of Doubt, little time was wasted on worry. Exhaustion descended as heavy and inescapable as the tropical humidity, and the men quickly fell asleep. So we're going to learn a little bit about the jungle here, which I think is really fascinating. And you can add to it, Brent, as you've gone down the rabbit hole.
Do you know how dense it is down there? Like, there's no wonder that you're not going to get starlight. You can barely get sunlight through the foliage.
Right, the canopy and stuff. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, you do have the river. If you're camped right on the edge of the river, you do have, for example, some light that can break through, because that's the only place where the sun can get through to the floor of the jungle. But if you've ever hunted like out west in a thick Oregon coast timber patch, there's no sunlight in there. It's just darkness. And when the sun goes down, there's no moonlight or starlight.
If the sun's not hardly strong enough to get through, the moon's not going to be.
Exactly. And it gets so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face. And the Amazon's got to be 10 times worse. When you watch that Meat Eater episode where Ranella is down there in the Amazon region and he gets bit by the bullet ants, they talk about how they have night vision stuff going on with their cameras and everything, but they cannot see. I mean, they're blind. When the sun goes down, it's inky black dark. This is like pre-flashlight too.
You have lamps.
So,
some oil lamps helping you see and stuff.
Anyway, back to the book. When Roosevelt emerged from his thin balloon silk tent on the morning of February 28, 1914, he stepped into the narrow clearing that his men had carved between the water and the forest, which every time you set up camp, you're going to have to carve it out. You're going to have to chop it down to make a spot to just set up tents and stuff. What's interesting is, and it's so creepy because every bug and everything that's there, but he said, it says that he emerged from his thin balloon silk tent. Think about that. A balloon silk tent versus today's gear. Man, that sucks. That sucks. Talk about primitive equipment, right? Wool, things like that. I mean, they're what they were. they're serviceable, but man, we have some good tech today. So make sure it turned off. Okay, Brent. So Theodore Roosevelt has been around the world in different places and seen some things, including California's enormous redwoods, and he marveled at them. But he had never seen anything like the prodigy of nature that surrounded him in the Amazon. The massive trees rose so high that their crowns disappeared in the tangle of branches and flicker of sunlight above his head. Branches of neighboring trees wound around one another like interlaced fingers, and heavy vines unfurled from the treetops like a ship's rigging. In the early morning light, the scene that Roosevelt beheld was a breathtaking tableau of timeless nature, tranquil and apparently unchanging. That impression, however, could hardly have been more dangerous or deceiving, for even as the men of the expedition gazed in awe at the natural beauty surrounding them, the creatures of the rainforest were watching back, identifying them as intruders, assaying their potential value, surveying their weaknesses, and preparing to take whatever they might have to give. You're not about the rainforest, are you, Brent?
It has not sold me as a getaway destination, that's for sure.
Far from its outward appearance, the rainforest was not a garden of easy abundance, but precisely the opposite. Its quiet, shaded halls of leafy opulence were not a sanctuary, but rather the greatest natural battlefield anywhere on the planet, hosting an unremitting and remorseless fight for survival that occupied every single one of its inhabitants every minute of every day. It reminds me of a coral reef. It's another highly competitive environment. You know, I had reef tanks in my house of 200-gallon tanks of ocean life, you know, and if any fish got too close to one coral or an enemy, it got 8, you know, other fish would eat it. Like the environment was highly competitive. Crabs eating other crabs, and it's just this bacteria getting things. Like you said, it's a fight for survival that occupies every single one of its inhabitants every minute of every day. And there are some places in the world like this, and the Amazon jungle is one of them, where every second is just like a battle for survival. You got plants that grab and eat insects that try to feed on them, and you got insects that kill other insects. I mean, it's just a vicious, you know, ecosystem. And so the book goes on to say, though frequently impossible for a casual observer to discern, every inch of space was alive, from the black, teeming soil under Roosevelt's boots to the top of the canopy far above his head, and everything was connected. A long, linked mat of fungi under the soil consumed the dead and fed the living, completing an ever-changing cycle of remarkable life and commonplace death, which had throbbed without pause for millions of years, and of which Roosevelt and his men, knowingly or not, had now become a part.
When you, I was trying to see where Venus flytraps, when you said they were, plants are eating stuff, so I Googled where do Venus flytraps live. Guess where they come from?
Arizona?
The Carolinas, North and South Carolina, are where Venus flytraps grow natively.
Yeah, I was going to say Texas. Yeah.
I 100% would have thought.
But there's a lot of other plants that are similar that live in the Amazon that have all sorts of traps and movements. They are insect-eating plants.
Well, continue. Me and the carnivorous plant wiki are going to get acquainted.
So in addition to that, though, reading about this, one thing you learn as you study the Amazon is there's a completely different ecosystem that lives at the top of the forest, in the treetops and the canopies, than what lives on the forest floor. And every 10 feet, it's like a new ecosystem, or 30 feet of completely different animals, plants, and critters that have adapted to live in the environment.
Yeah, and they don't commingle ever. If you're from the top and you go down to the bottom, you could get 8.
Right. Okay. So for millions of years, it's throbbed with life. Unlike the woods of New England, where Roosevelt had spent years exploring and learning about nature, the rainforest floor was not covered with thick leaf litter or plant life, but appeared largely empty, characterized only by a shallow layer of soil shot through with thin white thread-like fibers. Just as unusual, each tree in the Amazon rainforest appeared to be nearly unique. Many trees had commonly shaped leaves, but stands of or groupings of a single tree species were very rare. And after identifying one tree, the men could search for hours before finding another of the same kind.
Jeez.
The trees themselves were often strange and complex, characterized by huge buttresses, flowering trunks, or apparent branches that plunged back into the earth or were wrapped in enormous looped or curled vines. Most important, other than insects, which teemed everywhere, the forest seemed virtually empty, with little or no sign or sound of any inhabitants. That's what's weird, is you expect to be there and just hear all these sounds, and instead, with that whole setup, you just hear nothing.
It's a forest of ninjas trying to kill the other ninjas. I get it, man. I wouldn't peep up in there either.
Right. Yeah. It's like a death zone. Everything's quiet. Don't draw attention. Don't draw attention. These odd characteristics were not merely natural curiosities or local quirks, but direct reflections of the deadly, exquisitely efficient competition for survival that was taking place all around Roosevelt and his men. They also reflected the profound impact of the evolutionary competition on all forms of life in the Amazon, where it has produced some of the most phenomenally diverse and specialized plants and creatures anywhere on Earth. It's interesting when you go to an extreme environment like this. I spent a week in Death Valley with a college class, biology and archaeology, and we were looking at everything from the rock formations to the wildlife. And as you dive into the animals that are specialized to live in a place like Death Valley, you're like, it looks like there's nothing there. Mm-hmm. It looks like everything's dead. How could anything live here? And then you start looking, you realize there's life everywhere, but it's on the verge of death every day. And everything is like a battle for survival. Only the most well adapted for that environment survive. I remember walking through this part of the desert, just walking along, looking around, and we came on these spiky like plants, bushes that look dead, but they have thorns, like long 1-inch thorns or 2-inch thorns that look kind of like a rosebud thorn out of control, and I'm walking along and I see impaled lizards on all these thorns, like 3 or 4 on this one, a couple on that one, and they're fresh. They're just bleeding. Some of them are squirming still. And I'm like, what is this? And these impaled lizards have been put there by birds. What are they, shrikes? Or I forget right now off the top of my head what species of bird. But essentially, they don't have the ability to actually necessarily kill the lizard, or there's some risk involved in that because they're not a very big bird. But they can swoop down, grab the lizard.
Shrike.
A shrike, yeah. So they swoop down, they grab the lizard, and then they just impale it, Brent, on a spiky thorn or whatever they can, and they stab it onto the thorn, and then they leave it there to die. And then as soon as it's dead, they come back and get it and eat it. It's macabre.
They'll do snails. They'll do rodents. Anything they can get their little creep. Man.
Birds are just miniaturized dinosaurs.
Shoot me with an arrow any damn day, dude.
So anyway, these birds, and so you get a feel for these environments that are extreme. And that's what Theodore Roosevelt's dealing with, is extremely unique environment with its own exquisitely deadly competition for survival. It goes on to say, while the process of evolution has continuously altered and selected the features of life everywhere on the planet, in few places have its workings been as conspicuous or its results as refined as in the Amazon. Like I said, when you go to an extreme environment like Death Valley or the Amazon, you're going to have some really extreme evolutionary results. Another thing that I found when I was in Death Valley is they had these like guppies, these fish that are only alive in this part of the world, and they live in a hot spring. So the water is like 100 degrees, and this fish actually lives in that hot water and has evolved to survive in that hot water.
Sink or swim.
And it's the and they are the only species that have evolved. They live in that particular little tiny hot pocket, and that is the whole species. There's no other like it in the world, right? So it's very easy for them to become extinct, you would think, because there's none. Well, these fish, they're like, well, we should take these fish out of this water.
Pupfish.
Yeah, pupfish. They say they should take those fish out of the water and put them into like a tank. And so that just in case something were to happen to them, maybe catastrophic to happen to the water source or whatever, it's just this tiny group of fish, they wouldn't want them to go extinct. Well, once they put them into like an aquarium situation, within a few months, they evolve into a different species.
What?
Something to that effect. So they can't just put them back in again. They change. So they kind of need the environment they're in. I don't recall all the details, but you're talking about some freaky stuff when you get into these extreme environments. Where you see some things that Mother Nature has done that is just off the charts, unique. They're just, in order to live there, things had to really adapt in a certain way. Otherwise, they'd be gone by now. Back to the book, the extraordinary range of forms that characterizes the Amazon rainforest has been attributed to many causes, all of which are likely to have played some role in creating the immense cornucopia of living things that surrounded the expedition. Perhaps the most frequently cited factor in the species of richness of the Amazon is the region's latitude, which has for millions of years produced generally stable temperatures and most environmental conditions that have favored the uninterrupted development of the jungle and its inhabitants. Another prominent explanation is the repeated isolation and reconnection of the jungle to other continents and habitats over the broad sweep of time. Whereas some regions, such as Africa, have undergone fewer changes and reflect a comparatively low number of unique plant and animal species, the South American continent has at different points been cut off from or rejoined to other land masses. The separation of South America from the rest of Gondwana land, for example, created opportunities for the development of new indigenous species. That isolation was then interrupted by the rise of the Panamanian land bridge, which permitted the arrival of new species from North America and started new rounds of selection. So just basically as the continents shift around and different things have touched, different land masses have come in contact or shifted away from, their theory is that it led to a very unique set of a very broad and diverse set of animals. So the Amazon in South America teems with freaky animals in a way that Africa does not, is what they're getting at, because it is just because of how the world turned. Within the Amazon itself, some scientists believe localized changes of climate created shifting patterns of so-called refugia, or rainforest pockets, whose isolation offered unusual opportunities for the emergence of specialized plants, birds, insects, and other animals. New variants of life, particularly fish life, were also fostered by the long presence of an inland sea at the heart of the continent. Distinct new species are also thought to have emerged within enclaves set off by natural boundaries such as mountains and, of course, the channels and tributaries of the giant Amazon River itself. What an incredible place. And like I said, each layer of the rainforest has sort of its own ecosystem, like they're describing, or refugia, which cause a certain bird to evolve into a different type of bird than its ancestor, or its brother or sister next door that's in a slightly different environment. Boom, flash forward a million years, and now you have completely different animals that were at one time the same, but because of this unique pocket of, one square mile being unique the way it is, it caused a different evolutionary result than this pocket. And so you just have this weird, intense array of species, like even just in the canopy versus down lower in the floor, because that environment is so different and unique, midway up into the canopy versus, a third down versus at the top. It's a crazy place.
The Amazon is such a unique ecosystem. They have flying rivers, is what they call them.
Yeah. What do you mean flying rivers?
So we've talked about it a couple times, and I went and looked at it. That the trees down there, they say you can literally see the trees breathing, like they're fluctuating and moving because they're actually evaporating water. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking, Brian, how much would you guess an average forest tree would evaporate? How much water could you get out of a tree in a single day?
I don't know, because those trees are like they're like a block unto themselves on a city street.
They made 2,500-pound boats out of those things.
Yeah.
And those probably weren't the biggest ones.
When you look at those trees and they're as wide as this room, and then they go up 150 feet. That tree itself is its own ecosystem by itself. It is such a vast living object. I have no idea.
So on average, a tree will release 264 gallons of water into the atmosphere every day.
Multiplied by the whole jungle.
By the whole jungle, yeah. And so what you have is, it's crazy.
I do not want to go there. So much rain.
So much rain.
So much rain.
It's not even like that there's rain so much as there's literally just water in the air.
Right.
So much water that it collects above the rivers in these gigantic, thick, dense fog banks. And so you look, and I'll throw up a picture for the people that are watching right now. You can see there's just a bunch of trees, and then it looks like the river has come up out of the tree and is now floating down river.
Yeah, you're showing me those pictures earlier. Mm-hmm. So it's basically a cloud of water shaped like a river, where basically it's sort of a floating river, right? And then it drops water in its snaking path of clouds that is in the canopy.
So they've estimated, there's some Brazilian climate scientists have gone through. This is Brazil, and they have guessed, approximated. I don't know how they do this, but they do their voodoo. Approximately 70% of the country's, national income, all the fruits that they get, all the pasture land that they have. So I don't know if people know this, but Brazil is cattle country. It's run by the cattle lords.
Yeah.
70% of the country's revenue sources would be arid desert without those floating rivers coming down.
Yeah, right.
It's some 80% of all of southern Brazil's water comes from the Amazon's floating rivers.
Well, they've said for a long time too, like oxygen, carbon monoxide, and all that kind of stuff, that Amazon forest is so massive that it is a climate, it affects the global climate rather. So we should pay attention if we're going to cut it down, for example.
Yes, it's there's a lot of debate about that, but you can actually see parts. They've actually tried to leave little plantations. Like they're like, we'll leave a couple trees here, then we'll cut, then we'll leave some trees, because that's kind of what they do in Oregon.
Yeah.
Does not work down there.
No.
Basically, without the thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons of floating around in the air, it just turns into a wasteland.
Well, we're going to get into that right now, talking about the soil. It's going back to the book, because this is real critical. Despite the lush green vistas and overgrown shores that the expedition could see from the river, for example, the soil of many lowland rainforests is not rich or fecund, but rather has adapted to recycle nutrients with extraordinary speed. The same abundant precipitation and steady temperatures that support life also leach minerals from the soil, and intense tree and plant growth exploits every available nutrient, leaving the floor of many tropical jungles, including the Amazon, permanently hovering at the margin of exhaustion or zero nutrition. And so what has been the problem is that when they cut down the forest so they can grow a crop, when they cut down the forest, all the nutrition, all the nutrients is in these living organisms.
It's not in the ground.
It's not in the ground. There's nothing left, because everything is consuming every scrap or ounce of nutrition. So when native folks cut down huge swaths of forest and then they go and plant a crop, nothing grows, because the dirt is just dirt.
Garbage.
There's garbage. There's nothing there.
There's no enzymes. There's
For
no
millions
germs.
of years, the nutrients in the soil are just sucked into the life in the forest. You see that in our own North American climate. You have the slash and burn. You cut it, you burn it, and all the nutrition from what you cut dies, burns, it goes into the soil. But you can see how people grow crops, cut them, take them out, cut them, take them out. You keep sucking the nutrients out of the ground, but you're not putting any nutrients back in, because you're harvesting it all and selling your corn and your wheat and your crops. And that's how you burn out land, right?
Have you seen the mineral deficiency? They take a case study of broccoli from like the 1950s, and the vitamins and the minerals that are absent from it. The head of broccoli that you eat now, that our grandpa would have been eating at our age, is missing 40% of the iron that it would have had, because it's not in the soil.
Right. And it's even worse. You go further than our grandpa back. It's crazy. And so this is what they're dealing with. This is what the forest is like. You're talking about a nutritionless ground or soil. So what ends up happening, sadly, is when you cut down the forest, you can get like one crop out of it.
And then you're done.
And then it's done. Nothing will grow. So then they got to cut more to get a crop out of it, and they got to cut more to get a crop out of it. And so it's a very inefficient use of that resource, right? Because it's like once you cut it down, it's tricky. If you log it for timber and stuff, there are sustainable ways to do it, to work with the jungle. But your traditional, well, we just got to plant a crop, grow it, and sell it.
Yeah, does not work.
Doesn't work. It's a doomed venture from the start, and it ends up you just keep burning out the forest, and
they've tried several ways of logging the Amazon, and the only ones that have been successful is to go basically down there and find one gigantic tree, take out the one tree, and then get it out of there somehow. But the problem is you can't get it out.
Yeah.
And so...
No, it's tree choked and nasty. No, dude, when I'm on Prince of Wales Island and I have bushwhack through the forest to get to the alpine, and the closer you get to where the sun is breaking on the tips, the thicker it gets, that last bit. You're like going through Devil's Club, and same thing on the Oregon coast. You get into that stuff where you got a machete and you're just chopping your way through. It sucks. On Prince of Wales Island, when we did that, we basically walked up riverbeds all the way to the peak because it was the only pathway there was. Otherwise, it was just choked. And the Amazon is like that on steroids, crazy. For plants and trees, competition for available soil nutrients is paired with the competition for sunlight, which is essential for photosynthesis. That green plants, they use that to create carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and water. Every kind of plant or tree, therefore, represents a unique trade-off between the quest for water and soil nutrients on one hand and the quest for sunlight on the other. Soaring more than 150 feet above Roosevelt's head and out of sight in the green canopy were giant emergent tree species that had secured their survival by putting all their resources into the effort to outrace their competitors to the sunshine. For fast-growing trees, the trade-off for speed is inadequate defense against insects and vulnerability to the storms that cannot reach the lower, more sheltered layers of the forest. Unable to sink deep roots in the thin forest floor, canopy trees are also generally obliged to develop elaborate support systems at their base, either with giant triangular buttresses that surround the bole or tree trunk, or so-called flying buttresses that look like inverted branches. This is wild, man. On the forest floor where the sky is all but obscured by such tall canopy trees, smaller plants or trees with limited resources must develop increasingly refined strategies to find place in the sun. The most obvious of these strategies is to avoid the cost of building a structure capable of reaching the canopy by simply climbing a tree that has already done so.
There you go.
This opportunistic strategy, adopted by vines and lianas, can permit a newcomer to remain anchored in the forest floor while growing rapidly to the canopy. But since even vine construction requires substantial resources, it entails complex choices about which tree to climb, a requirement that has produced astonishingly sophisticated traits. Some Amazonian plants, for example, can shift as necessary between tree-like form when they receive sunlight and a climbing vine when they find themselves in shade. Others can transform themselves into trees once they reach the canopy, abandoning their host and winding their viney stems together into a trunk. While most plants naturally seek the sun, other Amazonian vines have adapted to seek out the dark bases of large canopy trees that might offer reliable support, and only then to turn upward toward the light. Rainforest vines send out tendrils that reach out delicately to encounter a potential host, then curl to grasp it once it is found. A principal risk of the vine strategy is the danger that the host tree will sway and break the vine. So, many vine species have adapted by developing slack in the form of elaborate loops, curls, and coils, lending the rainforest the distinctive draping character that Roosevelt could so easily see and admire. Like the Tarzan vines. Another adaptation to this and other danger is for the vine simply to abandon its connection to the ground and to derive its water and nutrients entirely in the canopy, becoming an air plant or epiphyte, a category of plant that has generated literally thousands of species, including bromeliads, and orchids. After establishing themselves in the canopy, some epiphytes, in their turn, then reverse the entire process, sending aerial roots downward to establish a connection to the forest floor. So instead of them fighting for sun, they just grow where the sun already exists, and then they fight for the soil by growing downward toward the soil. I just think that the Amazon is just creepy. The more you learn about it, the more you're like, it's just creepy. I do not, of all the places in the world to explore, I don't want to go there.
That or the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah. Well, that's not even, to me, that's like exploring outer space. Not that interested. Mm-hmm. I like land.
Yep. Land's pretty sweet.
But still, I mean, of all the places, so just think though, this is painting the picture of what they're in the middle of. It was an audacious attempt. Like, you don't realize how easy it is to die in this kind of environment. And then you have the native people on top of it who are, head shrinking. Do they head shrink in the Amazon?
Oh, yeah. They head shrink down there.
Friends.
Oh, remember like episode 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5. We're getting up there now.
Yeah.
You mentioned the rubber trade.
Well, yeah, and how they buried the people vertical, too. That was weird. So just their head and shoulders stuck above the ground after they were dead, like kind of macabre, right? Like,
I'd much rather have that than the head shrinking nonsense. Yeah, so we went down there. Well, I shouldn't say we. Some European folks went down there for the rubber trade, and while they were down there, they came across shrunken heads. Mm-hmm. And so we started trading them for shrunken heads. And shrunken heads were worth quite a bit, pretty much everywhere in the world for some strange reason.
You're kidding.
No. And so, in fact, you would have tribes of people who would go out and hunt other tribes of people to make shrunken heads with to sell to the white guys.
You're kidding.
No, this is huge. It was a huge trade because you could trade a shrunken head for a gun.
Wow. Valuable.
Yeah, those European guys weren't playing around. They wanted those shrunken heads.
How do you shrink a head? Because
it's not what you would think.
How does a bone, how do you shrink a head?
So they actually, all right, folks, graphic warning here. Mm-hmm. First, you have to kill someone. And then you remove the head from the body.
Right.
And then you have to make an incision on the back of the head. Mm-hmm. You skin their head off. You take the skull out. Okay,
so you extract the skull.
Mm-hmm. You extract the skull. Then you have to scrape all the fat and stuff.
So kind of like you cape it out.
You cape out the face and everything. I mean, like you have like the eye
cape
sockets.
It out like you do a deer or an elk or a moose or something.
And then you they shove beads and seeds underneath the lips and in the nose to keep them up.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, traditionally they end up what's the word I'm thinking?
Sewing.
Yeah, sewing or stitching the mouth shut. Mm-hmm. And then they make a wooden ball. Mm-hmm. And then they try to hollow the ball out as much as possible.
You're just describing human taxidermy.
Basically is what it is, yes. You shove that wooden ball up there.
But you make sure it's smaller than the head is.
Yes, you basically you're kind of crap shooting here. How big you're going to get that little shrunken head. So like children's heads were actually the ones that were sought after the most because you could make it look tiny.
Brutal.
You could basically get a baby head or something to the
size of your
chipmunk.
Fist. Oh, no, really?
Tiny. Okay. You can bring them down to, I think it said 1/4 of this original size. Okay. Have it still retain it. So it's very important. They're, I forget what it is, but they're very lower jaw centric. And so the look that you're going for, there's a look for these things, bro. You can tell a real shrunken head versus a fake shrunken head based on the jaw. Okay. So the Native Americans are all about that. They're all about that jaw right there. And so you want a jutting lower jaw. And so then after you've got your head, mouth stitched, you shoved it full of beads and whatnot, you get a giant pot, and then you pee in the pot, and then you grab a bunch of native plants that are full of tannins, and then you boil it. And then you bring it out, then you hang it up, then you just wait for it to do its thing, and it shrinks down around that ball to done.
Wow. And then they sell it.
So originally, like all things, they were for what they believe were religious purposes. / they were a big don't F with us. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, if you've got 50 shrunken heads around some dude's hut, don't go near his hut. He's got a thing he is into, and you don't want to be a part of it.
Right. All right.
But they also gave power.
Okay, so we have established that. So that's like I said, all these reasons are why this is a bold journey Roosevelt is on.
He could have walked out and ended up being a shrunken head.
A little more about the jungle, and then we'll wrap this up. It just kind of helps paint that picture. I'm fascinated by nature, so I find this interesting. In reaction to the attempts of freeloading vines and epiphytes to benefit from their hard-won position in the canopy and to protect themselves from being shaded over by such parasites, trees have developed many protection methods of their own. Some have developed smooth bark that keeps tendrils from attaching, and still others have adapted to slough off bark, leaves, or indeed entire branches to send epiphytes and vines crashing to the forest floor. Throughout the jungle, moreover, trees have adapted to prevent multiple deaths from tree falls or blights by separating themselves at regular distances from trees of the same species. That's what's fascinating. If you have an insect that, or bacteria or fungi that happens to attack your species, it could wipe out an entire
ecosystem,
grove of trees. But it seems that every tree in the Amazon doesn't sit by its neighbor.
So you're saying they're all racist?
They're all they're very intermingled. In fact, they don't stay together in groups. That way, if it does get killed by a certain parasite, it doesn't infect the whole population because it's isolated. Everyone is isolated. From his vantage point on the shaded forest floor, Roosevelt stood far below much of this unceasing evolutionary combat. Crowded with broadleaf trees, crowning vines, and epiphytes, as well as the hundreds of insects and animal species that rely upon them, the upper canopy is difficult to see from the ground, except in the roof-like function that its name implies. By shading everything below it, the canopy helps to obscure much of the activity that takes place in the understory, or middle level of the rainforest. Its shading action also contributes importantly to the relative absence of undergrowth on the forest floor, where the men of the expedition found that they could move about with surprising ease. While sunlight from the open river made the shoreline an almost impassable wall of trees, vines, and dense underbrush, once that barrier was breached, the dark interior of the jungle, broken only by occasional gaps in the canopy and scattered speckled light, revealed a labyrinth of tree trunks and vines, but little else. I see that in Prince of Wales Island, right, Brent? We'll be going down like an old logging road, and it's just a wall of brush and trees and dense cover. And you beat your way through it, and then you pop into an old growth forest, and it's wide open.
Yeah.
There's nothing in your way.
Undergrowth.
No undergrowth. There's 3 inches of undergrowth. Trails are just everywhere. You just walk free as anything.
Yeah, that big bear you shot up there in Prince of Wales, flat. Oh, well, not quite flat. There was a bunch of fallen trees and stuff.
Yeah.
But there was no undergrowth, really.
Yeah, no sunlight could get there. So there's nothing there. All that sunlight is blocked by the trees, so all the life is at the very top of those places, not down low. But, man, getting from the river to the forest is you got to beat back a whole different ecosystem of thick brush. Growing up in Oregon, in that wet kind of that temperate rainforest, you just have to, fight your way through. But, so going back to the book, as the men of the expedition arose and started their morning routine, Roosevelt was able to admire the complexity of the jungle before him, but could only guess at the mysteries that it held beyond his view. So complex and interdependent was the ecosystem he and his men had entered that the jungle itself could appear to take on the attributes of a living being. If Roosevelt had been able to see the rainforest from a distance, he could have watched it breathe, like you were describing. As the trees transpire or, in a sense, sweat, they pump water into the atmosphere from their leaves. In the warm air, the water quickly evaporates and is recycled as rain. Yeah, just like what you were describing earlier. As the ex-president stood at the river's edge, surveying the jungle he hoped to master and explore, the forest surrounding him met the dawn by exhaling thin white clouds of condensing moisture that rose over the canopy above him like the breath of a wolf on a winter morning. That's it for today. So you got a real feel, not much into the journey, but a feel for what the rainforest is, what the Amazon rainforest is, and what they're dealing with. We're only on day 1. And they had 114 stops, and they are exhausted. And this could be a month, 2-month, 3-month journey. They don't know.
They have no idea.
And they have no idea what barriers they're going to come across. And if they are not able to float out because there's a section of the river that has rapids or waterfalls, how are they going to portage a 2,000-pound boat?
They're not.
And as it states, the boats are sinking because they're crappy and they had to makeshift those boats. And those boats, what did Roosevelt say? Well, they're going to get lighter as people die. Or if that doesn't happen, they're going to get lighter as people eat stuff and consume it. So either way, the boats are going to get lighter. The rations are really thin because Anthony Fiala, who was the failed explorer to the Arctic, didn't do a good job. So there's a long road ahead, and we're just about to get deeper into that. But anyway, I thought that chapter was interesting, just because, it's all about the rainforest. The next chapters, just so you know, it's the next one is Twitching Through the Woods, Being Watched, Death in the Rapids, and Attack. Those are all the upcoming chapters. So some of these pictures, Brent, if you can get some of these pictures, I don't know if you can find them and drop them in the video version of the podcast, but there's Kermit right here. And you can get a feel for what it looked like. These are old black and whites. I got to tell you, this part where they are floating down the river.
Who brought the camera?
It looks awful. This is, I think, before they went deep, right? It was right there at the head where they went on the overland journey, and they were on the bridge, and they floated out of sight. I don't believe they took they didn't, but it does show that Kermit had a camera. But looking at this is disturbing. So right here, there's this picture right here. It says, able to span the water with his rifle. So this is the total width of the river right there in this spot. How the River of Doubt could contract from 100 yards across, 100 yards, to less than 200 yards in a single mile. That's a nightmare. 100 yards wide to, what do you say, 2 yards? Yeah, 2 yards. That's a lot of water, Brent.
How does it do that?
They're thinking that in this little channel that it could be 100 feet deep.
Oh.
Like,
it got narrow but got crazy deep.
Because
I was like, there's no way. Like
that is just so scary. Like it says, no canoe could ever live through such whirlpools. When you have the water go from 100 yards wide to
it's churning
2 yards wide and hauling butt, you're going to create some vortex whirlpools that just go straight down. And when you look at some of these rapid choked photos or the forest, dude, it's creepy, man. Creepy. And then, of course, you have the indigenous people who would like to see you dead. When you look at these images of the Amazon and the Amazon River and then all of its tributaries that come off of it, water everywhere. And each of those rivers, man, some were very useful to get from one point to another and some not so much. But yeah, anyway, that's it for today's podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you like the show, help us out. Continue to support us by checking out all those affiliate codes that we have, all the coupon codes that we try to get you discounts on the gear we review and all that. It really helps us keep the show going. So check that out. That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Stay gritty.